All right, guys, let's learn more about Django and now tying in databases. So let's get this here. All right, so I'm going to create a new project, make this a little larger so you guys can read it. All right, so let's make a new directory. Let's call it Django ORM. Simple enough name, and bring up a coding window. Django ORM. All right, VS Code should pop up, and there it is. All right, so we're going to create a new Django project. Again, hopefully you guys remember this from a couple weeks ago. We'll go through the process one more time together, or probably more than once, but all right, so if you remember from 2 weeks ago, we learned how to create a Django project and how to create HTML templates that we can render pages for the client. But now we're going to actually tie in a database. So this will let us get away from CSV files. Again, we've seen kind of the limitations of CSV files. They're not really efficient. It's kind of hard to search and find things in them. We learned about databases last week where we saw the advantages of it, where we can query a database. It's much easier to kind of find records and update records rather than having to kind of do it manually. And that's what we're going to use now with our Django project so that we don't have to use CSV files to store our data. And again, life will be much easier because of it. So let's see, I'm going to bring up this diagram that we saw, I think, a couple of weeks ago, just to have a reminder of what our entire process, or not process, but our project looks like. So let me get my slides here. Sorry, I had to reboot my computer, so bringing these new windows up. So we have this not so great analogy that I came up with, but we're going to learn about the kitchen staff, I guess, and the kitchen, where we kind of store everything. So that analogy aside, this is what our Django project looks like. Just a refresher, client, the end user, is basically your browser that's making a request. That request is kind of serviced by the urls.py, the routing portion, where Django determines, all right, who's going to actually handle this request. So the URLs determine, all right, we find the exact view handler that's going to handle the request that was sent in. And then the views is kind of the middleman that's doing pretty much most of the work, where they will interact with models.py. We're going to introduce this today. We're going to use models.py appropriately. I know in the past we kind of simulated what models.py might be containing, but today we're going to actually create some models in Django. And those models are going to be responsible for working with our database. So we're not going to write any SQL queries. The queries are going to automatically be done when we create our models, and Django will use those models to query the database for us. So that's where models comes in place. So this was where we store our data. This is how we retrieve it. And then views.py can use that data and serve it up just like before when we had CSV files. All right, so let's get to creating a project. I'm going to go back to my VS Code, bring up my terminal, and hopefully remember the steps. So the first step I want to do is create a virtual environment. So I'm going to do python-m -env, and I'm going to name my virtual environment .env. So that should create a new folder for me. That's takes a second. All right, so again, this basically created a new folder that has all the libraries I'm working with for this bubble, right? So my virtual environment is a kind of like a virtual bubble, and any installations I have here is what my project's gonna be using. So once I have my virtual environment, I want to get into it, and to do that, I need to type source, name my virtual environment folder /bin/activate. Again, if you're on a Windows machine, your commands might be a little different. You should be able to Google those. But now that I'm in my virtual environment, notice that my terminal prompt is prepended with my virtual environment name. So I know I'm in there. All right, cool. So those were our two preliminary steps. Now to create a Django project, the first thing we need to do is install Django. I'm going to do pip install Django. And that will download some files. Again, they're going to be added to my lib folder. But you never need to worry about your virtual environment folder. Just know that all the good stuff that you're using is in there. Like you don't ever need to tinker with it. So, all right, so we did pip install Django, installed a few libraries into our virtual environment. One additional step we're going to start doing now is we're going to install another library. So Raphael introduced psychopg last week. We're going to be using that with our Django project. So I'm going to do a pip install. And the important thing here is that you need to use psychopg2. If you do not have that 2 there, you're going to install a different version, and it's not going to work well with Django. Django needs a specific version. I'm not sure if there's a patch for Django that allows you to use CyclePG3, but we're going to use CyclePG2 to make sure you install the right library. Porfi, your hand up.
Yeah, when I try to do, like, I can install CyclePG, but when I try to install CyclePG2, I get like a wall of red text errors that I won't install.
All right. Do you have any summary of what that error says? I'm just curious if anyone else runs into that. I want to make sure we're prepared for it.
It just says that something from the, it appears you're missing some prerequisites to build the package from source.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, let me know if any other students have the same issue. So I'm going to try running CyclePG2. It takes a bit of time, but hopefully there will be no errors here. Porfi, yeah, maybe reach out in the question channel. I don't know if the TA or someone else might be able to help you, or we'll try to reconnect in the afternoon. But that is concerning that you're getting a bunch of errors. Hopefully it's easy to fix. All right, so for me, my CyclePG installation worked, thankfully. So if I do a pip list, it should show me all the versions in my virtual environment. So notice I have Django 4.0, CyclePG version 2.93, and a few other libraries that seem to have gotten installed. All right, so the reason we need to install CyclePG2 is that is mandatory for Django to use a Postgres database, right? So as Raphael introduced last week, CyclePG is kind of that interface that allows Python to interact with Postgres. And that's exactly what Django is going to be doing for us. All right, so we installed Django, we installed CyclePG2. I think this would be a good time to do a pip freeze, always a good step to not forget. So requirements.txt. This will create a new file. That's going to have all the versions of everything I've installed in my virtual environment. So again, there we have Django. Notice that CyclePG2 is in here now. That's good to have. Another step, easy to forget later on, so I'm just going to do that right now. I'm going to create a git ignore. I spelled that correctly. Git ignore, and I want to ignore my virtual environment. So I'm going to do .bnv, and that should ignore it. I do not have a Git project. Keep in mind, I've not created a Git project. This is not associated with any Git project right now, but if I do create a Git project, a git ignore would be useful there. So I'm just going to create that right off the bat. All right, so we download libraries, create our requirements.txt. I think that's all the boring stuff. Let's actually create our Django project. So to do that, our command is Django-admin start project, one word, and we want to name our project. So I'm going to name my project school_proj. I like having that appended proj just so I know that's what folder is which. And then this period, again, if you remember, if you add this period, it's going to prevent that nesting of folders, which I prefer, but if you don't, that's fine. You can have nested folders, no harm done there. But that should create a new folder. Let me make this larger, if that's easier to read. So I have a new folder here, and within that, I have some files that Django dropped in. So there's ASGI.py, WSGI.py. I don't really care about those right now. The two that I do care about is settings.py and urls.py. We've worked with these before, and we're going to need to work with them still. While I'm at it, I'm going to create a new app. So to create a new app, if you remember the command, it's python manage.py, which is this file that got created when I created my project. And then you want to type start app, one word, and then name your app. So I'm going to call my app school_app. Just keep my naming consistent. And there we go. So I have my project folder with a few files in it. My app folder has a few files in it, and we're ready to go. So now that we are using Postgres, we have two things we need to do in our settings file. So I'm going to go to my project settings file. So school_proj settings.py. The first thing, which is what we've done before, is find the installed app section and make sure we tell Django, hey, we have a new app that we created and we want you to refer to it. So I'm going to do school_app is the name of that. One thing that I want to just highlight that I do in case it's confusing or you have a question, I'm a fan of double quotes. So I always naturally just use double quotes. Notice that Django by default uses single quotes. It's not going to matter. Single quotes and double quotes in Python mean the same thing. I like doing double quotes because it makes it clear that this is a change I've added versus something that was pre-built in. So I think that's one benefit of being inconsistent with the quoting. I choose double quotes. So I know that's something I modified or added versus something that was there already. So that's what I do, just to kind of highlight why I'm actually being inconsistent on purpose here, of using double quotes instead of using single quotes. All right, so we added school app to our installed apps. That is step one we need to do. Our second additional step, now that we're using databases, is you want to scroll down and towards like the middle, you should see a databases section here. This is in our settings.py for our project. All right, in this section, we're going to make a modification. By default, Django is going to use SQLite, which is fine, but we want to use Postgres just because Postgres has a little more capabilities. So instead of defaulting to SQLite, we need to change the engine and the database name that we want to use with this project. So the engine, instead of having SQLite 3 here, we need to type in PostgreSQL. So make sure you have this. It has to be spelled exactly like this. There's no, this is not something we're defining. This is something that Django is looking for. So Postgres and then SQL at the very end. Single S, no double S's there. All right, so that's the first change for a database section. We tell it we want to use Postgres, and then we want to tell it what's the database name we're going to use. So I'm going to say, I'm going to call my database school DB. Hopefully I don't have that created anywhere. Let's make sure. Sorry, drop. Okay, so I'm going to say I want to use a database called SchoolDB. Important thing is Django is not going to create this database for me. We need to create this database manually before Django can use it. So Django is not the one creating it. We are the ones creating it. So I'm going to go back to my terminal and create a new DB. So create DB command. And I've chosen that I want to name my database school database. So whatever you name it in your terminal is exactly what you should match here. Obviously, I kind of did that ahead of time, but I'm creating a database first. So school_DB, gonna hit enter. All right, that got created. Now this name should match the database I created, which was SchoolDB. Given those steps, Django will be able to locate your database and use that automatically. So again, we don't need to write SQL. Django will do the SQL work for us. All right, so those are two things we need to check off. One is the installed apps name, and the second thing is we need to update our database section to use our Postgres database that we want to create. All right, cool. So now we create our databases. Let's actually start using our database. So now we're done with our project folder for now. I guess we could do URLs in a bit, but the interesting thing we're going to talk about is models.py. So we've mentioned this before in passing that models.py is one of those main files, but we haven't really used it because we never had a database before, but now we do. So let's talk about models, why we create them, how they kind of work, and hooking them up with our database. So in models.py, there should be nothing too exciting except for there should be an import that imports models from Django.db. This is a module we're going to be using to create our models. So let's just create our first model. Our models are going to be classes that represent our data. So very similar to what we've done before, where we created classes to store data. However, there's one big difference. So if I create a class, I'm going to name this. Let's call it student. I'm going to name this singular, not plural. I guess that could be a choice, but I'm going to create students, and then I need to use inheritance. So inheritance is a topic we talked about weeks ago, but I'm going to inherit from something called models.model. This base class is giving us all the functionality we need. So without this, this would just be a normal class that doesn't have any interest for Django's sake. But models.model has a bunch of kind of features built into it. You can actually investigate it. So if you actually do a control click or right click on it and click go to definition, this will actually let you look at the code that Django is using. Now, normally you don't know how to do this. You don't have to worry about it. You just read documentation. But you actually want to see the code, you can actually go to it, and then you can see what this class looks like. So notice that this is another class called model, and that is actually taking in another meta class. Not sure what that's doing, but don't really care. There's an init method. So again, nothing too surprising. We've seen init methods before. Notice it's initializing some data. You can kind of go through this. There's a lot of code, and I'll be honest, I don't know what most of this code is doing, but that's fine. That's the idea of, again, that encapsulation where, that abstraction where the complexity is kind of hidden for me. I don't care how it's doing, what it's doing. I just need to know what it's doing for my needs. So, all right, you guys can go through that. I'm not gonna go through this file because there's a lot of code there. But models.model, again, that's a class that we're inheriting from and extending with our student model right now. So we inherit, and then this is where the key difference comes in. In the past, we would always create an init method, right? And then do self, and then we'd pass in maybe name. And then we may store the name in instance attribute. This was the old way, and that's not going away in terms of OOP is meant to work this way. But for Django, we're not going to create instance attributes. We're actually going to create class level attributes for our models. And that's just the way Django has been designed. So we got to adhere to what it's looking for. So this is not what we're going to do. So sorry for the mislead. Just want to highlight, we used to do things this way where we take in a name, store it on the instance, and then use that for each instance. But instead of creating a init method, we just create the field that we want at the class level. So if I want a name field, I create it as a class level attribute, and then I'm going to assign it to something. And we're going to use that models module again. So, name is going to be a text field. So for this text field, I'm going to store it with models.char field. This is another class we're going to use. Models.char field. So that's going to be a character field. That we're going to need to tell it the max length. So max length is a property we can set. I'm going to say max length, let's say 64 characters. This is very similar to our good friend varchar from SQL. So you can imagine that this is basically a varchar 64 field. But again, we're not writing SQL, we're writing Django or Python code. In this case, we're creating a char field off the models module. Any questions about what we've done so far? So again, just notice the differences. One, we need to inherit from, let's actually write comments, need to inherit from models. And then we're just basically creating as many fields as we want, but these are class level attributes. Again, they're not instance attributes for our class. A couple hands raised. Let's go with Lyman.
So is this basically this is like serializing the data of a database through a class so we can access it in the front end? Is that basically what this is doing? It's just
yes, essentially. So yeah, if you guys kind of got the picture kind of already, which Lyman I think got, our database tables basically are like class instances, right? So we have a students table, we have a bunch of fields. That's the same thing as creating a class that has a bunch of fields on it. So that's how Django is going to translate data from your database into our Python or Django application. And we're going to do that by creating a class that has fields on it. And then whatever fields are in the database tables will be mapped over to these values in our class. All right, so Porfi, I think you had a question also.
Yes, thank you. So is like just Django doing some magic in the background so that no matter what we put under here, whatever title we give them, like name, date, whatever, it'll take all of them. There isn't like a specified number that we have to do. Okay.
Yep, that is a Django magic. So again, it makes our lives easier. So instead of writing code and creating database schemas, we just create the code for it and kind of create the schema with our models file, and then Django will convert that to the SQL equivalent. So again, if we need a foreign key or need a many, we will specify that in our models, and then that will actually be done on the Django database, or sorry, in the Postgres database. Was another hand raised? All right. So the question is, where did I find this models.char field? Did I just guess it? Did I make it up? The answer to both those is no. The real answer is reading documentation. Glad we all said it together. So I go to Postgres. Let's go model fields. Postgres model fields. Maybe that's another search. All right, Postgres. Relational. All right, not having good luck finding this, but usually it should be easy to find. PostgreSQL. Model reference. All right, there we go. So documentation, let's go for Postgres. I don't know what version we're on. Okay, let's search for char field. That did not hit anything. Sorry, I should be searching Django. What am I doing? There we go. Model field reference. Sorry, I was searching Postgres. I was meant to search for Django. So Django has good documentation. And then you can kind of go through and see what type of fields they have. So if you go to model field reference, that's the documentation page, scroll down, and on the right side, they have a table of contents. Notice all the types of fields that you can add. These are much more detailed and varying than SQL data types. So notice that there, for example, there's an email field. This is going to allow us to have automatic validation for, like, again, when users are expected to enter in email addresses, right? They need a certain format. They need something at something.com or .org or .something, right? The email field will actually try to verify that. So this is something that SQL doesn't have an email field. SQL just has a text field or a char field. But using an email field, notice that char field that checks the value as a valid email address. So this is just a slight benefit for us developers that we don't have to, like, reinvent the wheel in terms of email validation. This email field will automatically check that for us and make sure that the data is kosher before entering it into the database. So that's just one of many examples. Again, we can go through this list. I don't know which ones are too exciting, but date time fields, we could have file path fields. Again, you guys can kind of discover which fields exist, but know that I'm not making this up, as in the char field exists. It's an existing data type. We can read about it. So this is a string field for small to large size strings. If you want to use large amounts, use text fields. So it's just like SQL, where we have varchar for chart equivalent to char field. If you want to store more text, we use text field, just like the text data type in SQL. So make sure you read documentation. That's half the battle. It's not always fun, but that is what we require as developers to kind of understand how we use the technologies that we're using. So char field is what I'm using here. Notice that max length is a required parameter. It is not optional. So that's why we had to specify, 64 characters or how many characters we want. There might be some optional fields. So it looks like DB collation is an optional field. We can read more about that, but I'm not going to worry about collation right now. All right, cool. So we have our name field. Do we want to add anything else? Probably want to add something to make this a little more exciting. So what if we added an email? Email equals models dot. So I think our example on our curriculum page has char field, but we just saw that there's actually an email field. So why not just use that, right? If we intend this to be an email, we'll use this as an email field. I'm not sure if there's a max length. Probably there is. Emails can be kind of long. Let's make that 128 in case someone has a crazy long email. So this is still a varchar. This is varchar 28 with some extra validation for emails. We're going to learn more about validators tomorrow. So maybe I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. Just know that there's some additional logic behind the scenes of email fields to actually check to make sure it has a valid email format. Okay, I'm going to stick with these two fields just to keep our model really simple right now. We could add on more to it a little bit later, but let's make sure we understand the steps for creating our model and our databases. Kat, you have a question?
Yeah, do you still then need to validate on the front end if you're using the email validator?
Yes, so great question. And in this case, this kind of goes against what we're normally taught. Normally, we're taught to write dry code and don't repeat ourselves. However, the one exception is for data integrity. Having multiple layers or multiple security nets is advisable. So to Kat's question, yes, you would still want to validate on the front end. Usually in the form field, you can limit how many characters you could add in. You can maybe do some check in JavaScript to make sure they have the @ symbol, but it doesn't hurt to have more layers of security. It's better to have more redundancy and security rather than have like one central place that may or may not fail. So in this case, we're going to have security checks on our front end UI. Django should have some security checks, and our SQL database has those security checks that we talked about last week in terms of adding constraints that would check for certain requirements that we want. So yes, in this case, definitely have multiple layers of security. just in case one layer fails, the other layer should back us up. All right, so we have name and email. Right now, this is just two fields we have in our model. So student is our model, and we have a couple of fields here. Now we need to tell Django to create the SQL equivalent in our database. So to do that, we need to run a few steps through our terminal. So we created our model. Now we need to do two things. We need to make migrations and then migrate those changes so that Django talks to our database. So the first step is making migrations. This is basically converting what we have in code to some like pseudocode for Django to use when we actually push our changes to the database. So to do that, I'm going to write Python manage.py and then the command make migrations, all one word. Make sure you don't make any typos because this is a command Django knows. So if I type one word, make migrations, and hit enter, notice it kind of summarizes what it just did. It's going to create the model of students. So what actually happened with this command? If you notice in your file explorer, a new folder should have gotten added called migrations. This is something that Django added, something that you don't manually need to do. If you open this up, there should be a new file called 001_initial.py. Again, you don't need to worry about this file. This is just something that Django is going to use. But if you're curious, you can peek into it. So let's take a peek. All right, so this is a Python file, and it has some information in it. It looks like it's creating a model. So it's calling create model. Then we name students. Notice it has a list of fields. So one thing I do want to point out here. Notice that there's an ID field for my model. Even though looking at my models.py, notice I did not create an ID field here, right? So for our database tables, we always created an ID field, right? When we did create table, we always seem to have an ID field that was our primary key. Notice I totally omitted that for my student model right here. And that's because Django is going to take care of me for it. So we don't need to specify a unique ID field. Django is going to do that by default. So if I look at, again, my initial migration file, notice that there's going to be a field called ID. Notice it is the primary key. This is all Django stuff that Django is going to use. So again, we don't have to write this ourselves. We don't have to worry about this file at all, aside from knowing that it got created when we ran make migrations. All right, so this file is going to be used by Django to actually write the SQL and create all the appropriate structures in a database. Right now, we've only created that file. If we actually want Django to run that file, we will do a migration. To do that, we type Python manage.py and migrate. I think we introduced this command briefly a couple weeks ago, but what this command is going to do is tell Django to commit all the uncommitted changes from its migrations to our database. So this is where our database actually will get structures created for it. So if I run this migrate command, it's going to run this migrations file that got created automatically. So I run migrate, hit enter. Let's take a look at the summary because there's a lot of stuff in there. So I'm going to highlight all this stuff. Can I do a command highlight? No, that's not me. But basically, most of these things highlighted here are some things that Django automatically wanted to migrate. This is nothing related to the model that we created. All this stuff is some backend stuff that Django could use for us if we want to. But there's one line right here. This is the migration that we ran for our particular app. Notice that school app is our app name. This migration was kind of combined with all of the other queued migrations that Django wanted to do. So one migration applied, one migrate command applied all these migrations to our database. Now let's actually take a look at our database to kind of get familiar with what Django did for us. So I'm going to get into my database by doing pSQL. The name of my database was school_db. All right, so I'm going to get into my database. I'm going to do a \D to see all the definitions that I have. All right, there we go. These are all the tables that Django has created in our database. Notice there's a lot of them. There's something called auth group. There's something called auth user. We'll learn maybe more about those next week. Notice that there's Django admin, a bunch of Django stuff. So again, this is not stuff we created or told Django to create. Django automatically just wanted to create a bunch of stuff in our database, and it just did. So all these things were created by Django. In addition to the default stuff, notice that there's seems to be two new tables. There's a sequence table, which we shouldn't have to worry about. That's that serial functionality where the IDs are auto incremented. But the main table we care about here is school app student. Notice how it's named. I did not name this table. Django named it for us. So it's named by prepending the name of our application and then the name of the model. That's the standard naming practice for Django. So school app student will contain all the records that get created from our application. So if we actually want to look at that table, do \d school_app and then students. All right, so this is what our table fields look like. Notice I did not write a single line of SQL. Django did the work for me. But now we have a table that has 3 fields in it. It has an ID field, which looks like big int is the data type that it shows. It has some sequencer. We don't have to worry about that. But there's also a name field and an email field. Notice that they're not null by default. So that is a default behavior for fields. Okay, cool. So this is what my table looks like. Again, I don't need to worry about this. If I never want to look at my database, I don't have to. Django is going to worry and do the work for me. So we have a primary key, nothing too surprising there. Any questions about the database side of things? How we got our database table created? Anyone remember the steps? So we created our model, we ran make migrations, and then we ran migrate to actually have that table created for us automatically. I'm going to pause here because I feel like it's a good time to pause. Any questions or confusion, comments that arose from these steps? Yeah.
Yeah, if you like make an error and you decide to add more, is that okay to do, or do you need to like get rid of the tables that you already created?
Great question. Glad you asked. That's the next thing I wanted to go over. All right. So Kat's question is, what if you make an error or you need to modify your schema, right? We talked about schema modifications last week a little bit, where like, usually you want to take time up front and make sure you think about the data and the data structures and try to, create the structures that won't have to change later on. That's the ideal case, but life's not always ideal. Sometimes requirements change. Sometimes you realize, hey, I forgot a field or I want to add a new field. That's fine. You can make schema modifications, but important steps we need to remember. So let's say my student model, I realize, well, what if I want to add in birth dates? Like that's a field that we need. Maybe do models. If you remember, there's a date time field. Let's go with date field if I don't care about the time. So date field, this does not require a max length. So this is how I create a new date field. So I just create a new class level attribute, assign it a model field. So again, you need to assign it a model field for it to work with your database. If I just did like, this is, something like, let's say I had my own date field, or how do I say this? Let's say I had a class called birth date. Like it's my own class, whatever, no functionality. I could create an instance of it right here. That's fine, but it's not going to treat this as a model field. This is just some other field that's in my model, but it's not going to be tied to my database. So this will not be a field that gets created in my database. If you want a field to be added to your database table, you need to use the models module and use one of their fields. So this won't do anything interesting in the database side. I need to use models.date field or some field type from the models module to get the functionality there. So again, that was just a random example. All right, so we added our new field. What do we do now? So anytime, and maybe I'm going to write this in caps, so hopefully you guys remember it in caps. Anytime you modify the structure of your model, all right, so I'm writing in caps, not to yell at you guys, just to hopefully have you guys remember, because it's easy to forget. You'll probably forget a couple times. I've done a bunch of times where I make a change, I try to run my application, I'm like, hey, it's not working. Most of the time, it's because I forgot to make migrations again. So anytime you change the core structure of your model, in this case, we added a new field, which is changing our structure, you need to run make migrations again. So if I do that, I'll do Python, oops, I don't want to write in caps anymore. Python manage.py, make migrations once again. So if I run make migrations again, all right, this is something that you're probably going to run into, so I'm glad we ran into it now. this is not an error. This is Django asking us to tell it how to resolve this, I guess, this issue that it's dealing with. So we added a new field. Django is saying, all right, what should go into that new field? Because we might have some data in our database right now. It's asking for that new field, should we either add a one-off default? So what should be the initial value for that field? Or should we quit this operation and specify the default in our field? So just to distinguish between those two options. Option one is saying, tell me right now what fields, what values you want for existing records in our database for the new field. So what should the default birth date be for all records in our database? The second option is, what should the default be for existing records and future records that get added in if we do not specify a birth date? So there's a difference between option 1 and 2. So we can do either option. Let's go with option 1. Let's see. Yeah, let's actually go with option 1. Yeah. All right, so now it's going to ask us, what do you want that default value to be? And hopefully I don't get into trouble here, but we need to tell it a default value that's probably not null. So I think that's a default value. So let's just put in a random birth date and see if it works. So let's try 2000 01 01. Again, that's not really a sensible default, so we might need to reevaluate our decision making here. Let's see if this allows me to enter this in. Leading zeros and decimal. Let's try a string. I always forget the valid format. Okay, there we go. So I've told Django for any existing data I have in my database, in this case, we have no data, but any existing data, this will be the new value for the new field I added. In this case, the default birth date is just January 1st, 2000. It's what random date I chose. So that was option 1. What if I didn't want to do option 1? Let's say I made a mistake here. I realized, hey, I don't actually want to commit this to my database. What do I do here? So if you look in your migrations folder, notice that there's a second file added here. So the first one has not changed. This is what I ran the first time. The second one contains only the change I've added. So notice that it's adding a field, right? It's calling some add field function. For this model, it's adding a birth date. Notice that the default value is what I told it to be. And yeah, that's what this migration file is going to run. Again, I don't really need to look at this. I rarely look at my migrations file. Just know that anytime you run make migrations, it's going to create a new file. It's not going to update your existing migration files. It's going to run these files in order if it needs to. But in this case, it already ran this one file. It ran 001 initial. If I run migrate the second time, it's only going to run the new changes. So if I wanted to run python manage.py right now, it will push these changes to my database. But let's say I was in that situation where, like, I realized it's not really sensible to create 2000 as the default. How do I kind of abort this? Well, easy way is just I'm going to delete my migrations file. So I'm going to hit control delete or control right click and delete this file. So I don't want to push this to my database. I did not run my migrate command, which means that no changes were made to my database. All right, so let's try this again. Let's run make migrations. All right, so notice I get that message again. It's like I've never ran make migrations after this step. So option 1 was provide a one-off default right now. What if I want to do option 2, which is abort this operation? I'll specify a default for this field in my model here. So let's do option 2. All right, option 2 says I want to create a default. So every model field can take in a default parameter. So again, I'm using keyword arguments here, and I got to tell it what the default is. So what should the default be for birth date? What if I want to make it none? So this is the equivalent of null for databases. What if I want to do this? Anyone see a problem with this potentially? As we kind of discovered earlier, it seems the default constraint for fields is not null, right? So when I created my name field and email field, when we looked at our databases, if you remember, not null was the constraint set on both those fields. How do I override that? As in, what if I want birth date to be a nullable field? Do I have the ability to do that? And the answer is yes, we do. So that's another keyword argument you could pass to any one of these fields. This is not a special value for date field. It's a valid value for any model field that you are creating. So in this case, I'm going to set null equal to true. This is saying this field is now going to be nullable, meaning you can insert null values and that's fine. So my default is going to be none, which is effectively null, and I'm allowing null values. So now this should be fine, assuming I have not made any grave mistakes. So let's say this is going to be probably a date field. All right, so that's what this model field is specifying. It's going to be a date type, most likely. I'm going to allow nulls, and the default value is going to be null. All right, so if I've done this correctly, I should no longer get this message because I'm telling Django what the default is. It's not going to ask me, hey, what do you want the default to be? So if I run make migrations again, notice it worked right out of the bat because again, Django knows what the default value should be for any existing records that may be in that table right now. All right, so if I look back in my migrations folder, notice I got a new migrations file. We can take a peek at it. All right, great. It's adding a date field with the appropriate values. Cool. Andrew Tran, question?
It might have answered what you just did, but underneath the hood, is Django dropping tables and creating them again, or is it altering tables?
It's altering tables. Great question. So yeah, we want to preserve the data we have. So it's going to be running alter table commands. And that is essential because again, we probably have a lot of data from application. We don't want to lose that data and how to recreate it. Porfi?
Kind of along the same vein of what Andrew just asked. So if you were to delete one of those classes, would it drop next time you do a make migration?
That's a good question. I've not really done that, but I'm going to wager a guess of yes, it should drop that table. We could actually try it because we don't have any data to lose right now. So let's actually try that after we run this one migration. So I ran make migrations because I made a change to my structure. Step 2 is push that change to our database. I'm going to run manage.py and migrate. All right, notice they ran only one migration file because all the other ones were ran already. I'm not quite sure how Django keeps track of which ones it's ran or not, but I don't really care. In this case, it applied only one migration file, which is school app 002, school student birth date, whatever that file was called. I got an OK, which means hopefully things look okay on the backside. So let's actually go back to our database, pSQL, school DB. All right, I'm in my Postgres shell. I'm going to run \d. The name of that table, if you remember, was our app name, and then our model name, which is students. All right, there we go. Notice that we got a new field called birth date. It is a date field. Notice that it is nullable, right? Because we told it we're allowing nulls as a keyword argument to our model field. That got translated to a nullable field, so we don't have that constraint, as opposed to ID, name, and email are not null by default. Okay, so just to reiterate, I know I've said it probably 3 times already. I'm going to say it a 4th time. Anytime you make a modification to your model, you need to run make migrations and then migrate again. So 2 steps there. Tell Django what changed, and then Django will tell the database how to change. Andrew Tran.
It's almost like mini git where you're like committing it to like the middle, then afterwards you're sending it up.
Yeah, I guess I never thought of it that way, but yeah, you're right. You're kind of staging changes with the make migration, and you can kind of abort those if you want. And the migrate is kind of like a push to your project or your commit, I guess. I guess commit is make migrations, and then pushing is migrate. But yeah, I never thought of it that way, but yeah, that's a good analogy there. All right, any other questions or comments about what we're doing here? You guys following along? All right.
This
Cool.
definitely looks a lot more simple, that's for sure.
Yeah, again, that's the thing. That's what Django's meant for. So again, I know I said, Django is going to be your new best friend. It seems intimidating at first, but it's meant to make life easier for us. So hopefully you can kind of see why this is much easier than writing raw SQL and how to deal with all those alterations and whatnot. All right. Porfi did have a question. What if we drop this? I'm curious if you guys don't mind wasting 30 seconds. What if I just delete this? All right, that's a modification I made to my models. I need to run make migrations. All right, notice it's going to delete my model students. I bet that will drop my table. So if I run migrate, all right, notice it dropped it. So if I go back to my database quickly, let's get maybe terminal. I'll do pSQL, school DB, \d. Let's check all the tables that exist or don't exist. So keep going down. Yep, notice that my table has been dropped. So Porphy was right. Yeah, that will do a drop table command. In this case, I don't want to do that. So what if, I deleted my table, I'm going to recreate it. I could run make migrations here, but what if I just think, all right, that was kind of silly of me to kind of create a model, make modifications, delete it. I can delete these migrations files. So I'm going to delete all 3. Make sure you don't delete your migrations folder. That sometimes happens, but I deleted all the migration files. Let's see if I can run make migration once to get exactly what I want. So trash that. Sometimes I will say this, and you guys may run into this. Sometimes Django does get confused. In that case, you might need to recreate your database. I've seen that before, but hopefully I'm not confusing Django too much with modifying its migrations file. Normally, you should not be modifying the migration file. So I'm kind of just doing things atypically here, but hopefully Django is fine with me messing around with it. So do make migration again. I made a typo. Oh, yep. So I made a typo. I meant migrations. Django has my back, correcting me to make migrations. All right, cool. So notice it created a new migration file, and this has everything I wanted. It has name, email, and birth date. It's almost like I just created this file from scratch. It's not, no modifications were made along the way. And then to push this to my database, I'll do manage.py migrate. All right, we don't need to check our database. We can trust it's there. We've checked our database enough. I don't want to keep going back to my PC shell. All right, so we created our first model. Again, this goes in our models.py file. This is specifically where Django is going to look for our models. So make sure you don't create some other file and expect Django to automatically know about it. We create our first model. Again, create a class, inherit from models.model, and then create fields by creating models that whatever field you want to create. And then we run make migrations, and then we run migrate after that. Okay, so if we are comfortable with all that, let's actually get back to our previous Django lessons of what else do we need to do here. So let's actually create some URLs, create some views, and then we'll talk about many different ways to create data within our database. But I just want to kind of hook this up to see us kind of get back to where we were a couple of weeks ago. So as a refresher, we need to work with URLs and views. So I'm going to start with views.py. Let's create a view to just show all the students that we have in our system right now. All right, that's our task right now. So let's say task, create a web page to show all students in our database. All right, to do that, I'm going to create a view. Let's call this view index, for lack of a better name. Let's change it. Let's call it list students. All right, that's going to take in a request parameter. Remember that Django is always going to pass the request object to our view handlers. So we take in requests, and now we need to return something. So let's return render. Render is going to take in the request objects. If I'm going too fast, let me know, but all this should be review. I need to tell it which template I want to render. So it's going to be, it's called pages/list students.html. And then I might need to pass it some data. So my data, right now, my data will be an empty dictionary because I'm not sure what I want to pass it right now. All right, so hopefully, again, this looks familiar where we call this render method. The render method takes in 3 parameters. One, required is the request object. Second is a template we are going to render. Third, optionally, if we want to pass that template some data, we can do it as a third parameter. Okay, but obviously I don't have my template file created yet, so let's do that. As a reminder, we need to create a folder in our app folder and call that templates. Must be named templates. Within that, we can create another folder. In this case, I'm going to create a folder called pages, because that's what I'm referring to right here, pages. Notice again, we do not need templates here. It's not going to work as you expect it. Django knows to look in the templates folder, so you don't need to prepend your location with it. When we look in pages, that's a folder I created. Let's create a new file called list students.html. And again, if you remember, this is going to be like an HTML file with the option to use Jinja, or I guess, Django template syntax, which is essentially Jinja, to insert any data dynamically. So let's create an HTML file. I'm going to short circuit this. All right, so I don't have CSS right now, so get rid of that. We have block main contents. Let's just put in data here. So I'm going to create a list and list every student that I have in my system. So let's do a for loop. Unordered list. Do a for loop in here. So again, remember your syntax. Got to use those curly braces and percent signs. We'll do for students in all students. We got to tell it when the for loop ends. That's just change the syntax. So end for. And then within our for loop here, we can create HTML elements. In this case, we're going to create list items. And each one of those list items is simply going to show the student.name. All right, so I'm expecting that whatever the student object I get back has a property or an attribute called name on it. I'm kind of taking some assumptions here. But again, if you can kind of connect the dots, this name field is the name field that I'm referring to. So I created a name field on my model. That ultimately is what I'm going to show in my template here. I'm going to pass it student objects, and they're each going to have a name attribute. All right, so again, a for loop, creating list items, nothing too exciting here. Maybe want a header here. Let's put it H2 and say all students in our school. Okay, so we've done the view part, we've done the template part. So again, views is the one actually rendering the template. Template, what we're gonna actually send to our user. Data, we need to figure out what our data is gonna look like. And this is where our models come into play. So previously we were using either hard-coded data here or using CSV files. We don't need to do anything too complicated, but we do wanna loop in our models. So I'm gonna do from dot models. That's referring to my models module file right here. So dot model is going to look in the current directory. I have something called models. I'm going to import my student model here. Okay, so I have access to this model. This is where things are going to be a little different. We need to know actually how to extract data from this model. So this is a class, and it's not really apparent how we actually have instances here, right? Because we don't have instance attributes here. They're all class level attributes. But whatever the way Django models works, you can treat them like instance attributes. But we need to actually get the instances from this model. So this is where we need to look up maybe some documentation. I'm going to look up Django. Let's go with queries. So making queries or query set API reference. We'll go with this. All right. So kind of scan this. I'm going to automatically go to .all because I know that's what I want. But query set, this is a new data type that we're working with in Django. This is like a list. So if you're familiar with lists in Python, it's very similar to that, but query set offers a lot more capabilities than just having a list. So we're going to use query set. We're going to use all, but we need to get all the objects from it. So trying to find objects maybe. So this is an example of using query set. So entry is going to be a model. We need to call .objects to get each of those instances from this model. So entry is our model. .objects is the actual instances that came from our database. So whatever data was in our database, Django is going to convert that to objects for us, and we access those by calling .objects on the particular model. And then we need to call .all to get access to the query set. So again, this returns a query set, which again is similar to a list, but it's not just a list. Query set is another data type or data structure, if you will, that we're using with Django. So I need to use this pattern to get the actual data that I want. So if I go back to my views.py, my data, I want something called all students. So that's what my template's referring to. And then I need to tell it, how do I actually give it a list of students? Here, I'm going to pass it students, which is my model, .objects, .all. All right, so this is an example of doing a Django query. What exactly is this doing? This is essentially doing a select star from students. Or I guess in this case, my table was named school app students. All right, so this is the equivalent SQL of what is being done right here. We're requesting all. So that is doing a select star without a where clause. All right, so that should give me back all student instances, and then I'm just going to pass that to my data. Any questions about what this is doing here? So again, if we were just writing SQL, we'd literally write a select statement to get all the data back from that table. Student.objects.all is doing that SQL work behind the scenes for us. It's querying our database saying, hey, we're requesting all the student data, please get that for us. Andrew?
Is it in key value pairs where it shows like what the value is referencing?
I don't believe query sets are key value pairs. I believe that they're kind of like lists of dictionary. I guess, yeah, the dictionaries might be key value pairs. We could actually print out a query set. I'm not sure what we'll see from it. Actually, I don't think we can print out query sets. Let's try it. I'm pretty sure it's going to be just non-helpful printout. It's going to just say query set without any data in it. But let's actually see what it is. I might actually forget if it serves anything useful in it. All right, so we pass it my data. We are getting the objects here, passing it to our template. So that's 2/3 of the battle. We did our view handlers, we did our templates. The last thing, if you guys remember, are our URLs. So I go to urls.py in my project folder. We need to redirect to our app. So I'm going to do import include. This is a function. I'm going to create a new path. Let's call this school. And then we need to do include. And then our app name. So our app name is school app. And then our module, which is URLs. So again, this line, without typos, this is tell Django to look in our apps URLs. Right, so this new path tells Django to look in our app URLs anytime we have a URL that's prepended with school/whatever. And this is a choice. We can name this whatever we want. So I could call this school, projects. I could call this school app, whatever I want to call it. I'm going to call it school just to keep it simple. All right, so with that in place, now if you remember from a couple weeks ago, we need to go to our app folder and create a new file called urls.py. Why Django does not create this for us automatically, I'm not sure. Can't answer that question, but I do know that I want to create this file and add some more routes here. So we don't need admin. We don't need include. We do want paths here, so let's just say students-all might be our base path. This will be handled by a view handler. So views.all students or list students, I think I called it. We'll check. And then we want to give it a name. So we'll call this list students. Okay, I need to import import the views.py. So I'm doing from .import views. Now I could use any of the objects from the views file. So in this case, I have a list students method, which is my view handler here. So that's what I'm referring to in my urls.py. I want to make sure I'm not going too quickly. So if I've lost anyone, if anyone has any questions, please ask me to slow down. But again, I hooked up my URLs. I do have a typo here, which is that. All right, so URL patterns, I'm telling it what additional path I want. And now I think I should have all my wires connected, right? So if I go back to my diagram over here, I created models, I've created view handlers, I've created my templates, and I've created my URLs. That's the whole piece of the puzzle, or all the pieces of the puzzle. So now when a client request comes in, it should be routed. The view handler says, all right, what data are we working with? We're working with the student model. Cool. I'll get the data as needed. We're going to render a template and send that back to our end user. All right. Hopefully I didn't forget a step, but we'll find out. So now I need to actually launch my server. So to do that, I'm going to do python manage.py run server. If there's any errors in my wiring here, my terminal will tell me when I try to run my server. So let's see what happens. Okay, luckily no errors, so we did everything correctly. My server should be running at port 8000. So let me bring up a new Chrome window. I'm waiting for Chrome, there it is. I want to go here. No, that's fine. right, localhost 8000 was where my Django server should be running. All right, this is actually a good thing. It's not an error. It's saying, hey, we need to go to one of these paths because there's nothing at this location. So if I go to /school, notice I don't have a /school, but it's telling me, hey, you have a student/all. Sure, I'll go to that. Django is being quite helpful. Student/all. All right, so we do have an error here. What's the error here? So it says print students.objects.all. That was an error. Let's try to read it. So school app students. It looks like this table does not exist. That's what I'm gathering here. So I'm not sure why that would not exist. And this might be a case because I was messing with deleting tables and creating tables. Let's actually take a look at our database to make sure that exists. So I do psql school db /t. Does that table actually exist? I'm actually surprised that it doesn't. All right, for some reason, it did not get added here. Did I not run migrates is a question. That might be the problem. So if I do /q, maybe I forget to run migrate. This was not intentional, so I know normally we don't want errors, but this is kind of life of developer, easy to forget steps. So maybe I didn't run migrate. All right, it says no migrations to apply. Okay, that's interesting because I did have this migration here. What do I do now? Can I tell it to run manage.py migrate? I'm going to try running my app name here. So I'm going to do school app to tell it specifically to run migrations from this app. Okay, so still no migration to apply. So I think I might have screwed over my database. So this happens occasionally. I think I created a table and then dropped it and then tried to recreate it. But Django's like, well, I already did the work for you beforehand. So I think at this point, I'm in that stage where I need to drop my database. This is unfortunate, shouldn't happen often, but I have a migration to run, but it's not running it. You know, we could try doing it Google, but the easiest way is dropping a database. So migrations not applying. Let's see what Stack Overflow says. Make sure that we have that. Yeah, so this is what happened. Deleting a migration directory is never a good idea. I think I deleted a file though. Yeah, so I think I've just kind of screwed over my project. Let's try one more thing. So if I try making migrations, make migrations school app, I don't think this is going to change anything. Yeah, no changes detected. Yeah, all right, so I'm just going to drop my database. This is unfortunate, that's fine.
Hey, Ankur, real quick, right before you drop your database, can I just see your tables just for my curiosity?
Sure.
Just in pSQL or whatever.
Sure. School pSQL school DBs. Yeah, so I did not see my table listed. And I think that's because I created it, deleted it, and tried to recreate it. Yeah, so these are the default Django tables. No, none of my app tables exists.
Yep. Can you take a look at the Django migrations table? Just like select star from it.
Sure. I'm learning something here. Select star from Django migrations.
I think we're missing a from there.
Yes. From and then semicolon. Always forget that. All right. So what are we looking for?
So this is what Django knows about the migrations it's already run. And as far as Django is concerned, it has run the migrations and it has recorded that they have been run. If you're doing some manual work, like dropping your tables, but like Django doesn't know about that, then that's how you can get into this kind of state.
Interesting. I learned something new here. So yeah, usually I just drop my database. I think that's a nuclear option. Raphael, would you confirm, can I just drop these records from this table? And do you think that would work if I drop 18, 20, and 21?
I do think that would work. Honestly, if I was in this situation, I would do what you were just saying you're going to do. I would just drop the whole thing and start over. But I think you're correct. If you just drop those rows, I think we can do what we want to do here.
All right, I'm going to try that. I've never done this, so full disclaimer, but I'm hopeful that if I drop these records, Django's going to know, all right, I actually didn't run this file before, because right now this file matches that name. So Django's like, I already ran that file. Why are you, nothing to do here? So I delete from, what is this? Django migrations. where, don't forget your where clauseless, you'll drop everything else. Where ID equals 18 or ID equals 20 or ID equals 21. See if this works. I'm curious. Delete from Django migrations where ID equals that. Okay, so deleted 3 records. That seems like what I wanted to do. Let's look at this table again. Django migrations. Oops, I want to do a select star. So Q. All right, so yeah, it looks like any of my school app changes are gone. So thank you, Raphael, for that tip. Let's try running migrations now. So trash this. Let's get out of here. All right, so I want to do Python manage.py. My migration file exists. So I don't need to run make migrations, but I want to see if this migrate will actually push stuff to the database. All right, awesome. Thanks so much, Raphael. Yeah, so dropping your database is like the last ditch effort. I think this is my go-to now. I didn't realize that migration table has a list of everything it ran. All right, cool. So now my table should exist. I'm going to assume that worked. If it doesn't, then we'll try it again. So I refresh here, server's down, Python manage.py, run server, because I killed my server. All right, so far so good, no errors here. Let's see if I refresh here. All right, there we go. So we got to our page. Obviously, there's no students listed here, so that's fine. We don't have any data in our database, but our template's rendering, and it should be going through any of the objects that we do have in our database. So this is going to be a good time to take a break. John Winko, you have a question, comment?
So for our previous issues that we're having there, rather than doing the drop and everything else or going manually into the migrations table, what about reverting migrations?
I've actually not reverted migrations in Django. There might be a command for that. Are you familiar? Is there a command that you
There
use?
is. I haven't used it specifically. I was just curious if you've.
Yeah,
run into
I've
that.
not used revert migration. So again, there's a lot to know about Django. That's not another thing I guess we could explore. I'm curious now that you mentioned it, but no, the key takeaway is normally you should not modify or touch your migrations file. That's kind of the main lesson I want to take away here. I know I did that just to kind of mess around with it. But normally those migration files, just don't touch them. Even if you like add a change and then remove a change, the migrations file will add it and then drop it later. So you should trust the migrations file will do what you expect. Don't try to condense them or modify them. So I was a bad example there. Hopefully you guys understand. Migrations file, Django will handle it. Don't mess with their files. Okay, so I think it's a good time to take a break. After the break, we're going to learn about how do we actually add data into our database without going into SQL, because we could write the raw SQL, but we don't want to. So there's a few ways we're going to go over. I know normally when we're learning a new topic, we want to just learn one way, but I'm going to actually teach you maybe 4 different ways to add data, just to kind of show you all the options we have and what you might want to focus on depending on your use case. So it's 10:55. Let's take a break here. All right, so far we've created a Django project. We hooked up all the wires, which are the URLs, the view handlers, the templates, and now we introduce models, part of the equation. And we were able to render a web page that should be showing us all of our students that are in our database. However, we've missed a key step, which is actually adding data to our database tables. Now, one way we could do that is going into pSQL and writing raw SQL queries, but we want to get away from that, right? SQL is not always the easiest to work with. Django should be able to handle that for us if we know how to work with Django to do that. So we're going to go over a few different ways you can add data to your data tables. And again, all of them have their own use cases. So let's learn about all 3. I know that's not usually what we want when we're learning something new, but should not be too much to take in. So let's, all right, so one thing I do want to point out, I print out my query set. Notice it actually has nothing in it because I have no data, but let's actually try adding some data and see if we get something useful for our query set. Let me clear some of these files out of the way. All right, I just want to deal with views and models. All right, so our views, again, we're querying a database to get all the data, but there's no data in there. So how do we get data into our database? Let's go with option number 1. Option number 1 is we can use the built-in Django shell to do this. I'm gonna bring up a new terminal. And if you type Python manage.py shell, That's going to get you into a shell where you could actually write Python and add data this way. All right, I don't find this to be very easy to work with. I prefer writing in VS Code, but you can use your shell to do the same exact commands that we're going to run through our data file. So you can use a shell. I'm just going to show it the way I go about it, but it's essentially the same thing. So if I want to get out of the shell, I think Control D should do it. Yep, Control D gets you out of the shell. Instead, I'm going to create a new file to run the code that I want. So in my app folder, this is I want to clarify, this is non-standard Django practice, as in there are better ways to do this in Django. We're just going to do it one way. So I'm going to create a file called data.py, just an arbitrary name I chose. And in here, I'm going to import from school app. And I think the relative naming of this does matter. So I'm going to use my app name dot models from models import students. All right, so student is the only model that we have right now. We're importing it from school app.models. Now again, I think we do need to prepend your import here with your school app because we're running it through manage.py. I think I tried it without it and it gave me some errors. So school app.models import student. Now we do simple Python to create objects, and then we're going to save those objects to the database. So what if I want to create new students here? To create an instance, I'm going to just do student, just like we would use any other class here. So notice I'm using a class, creating an instance that's going to be called new student. This goes back to our OOP week, so hopefully nothing too surprising here. Now I want to set some properties on it. So student.name is something that should exist, and we're going to set the name here. So let's go with Bill. I guess I don't have a last name field, so let's do Bill Gates as the name. We also had other fields. We had student dots or the other fields. I forget too easily. Email. So we'll do email equals Bill money at Microsoft.com. And then we also had birth date. Birth date can be nullable, right? So birthday is an optional field in that if we don't provide one, it's going to take a default value. In this case, the default is going to be none, also known as null. Let's actually provide a default for this particular student. So we'll do birth date equals. I actually don't know how to do this, so we'll just do date time. Just do now. Let's say he was born just now, just because I don't know how to mess with date times. All right, so we have a name, email, birth date. We created an object, and this object's living in our Python. We want to actually save it to our database. To do that, we need to manually call new student.save. All right, so the save method is something that exists on any model, right? So that's coming from our models.model. This class has a .save, has a save method that we're calling. Right, I don't have a save method in my student class that's being inherited from my model class. So if I call .save, this is the equivalent of doing insert into school app students, values, what is it? I guess we got to write this on a new line. ID, name, but we don't have ID, we only have name, email, birth date. Again, SQL from last week. If you guys want to know the equivalent, essentially this. So values would be single quotes, I guess, Bill Gates, whatever his email was. I think you guys get the idea, but I just want to show you the equivalent. So again, this is a part of our Django query syntax. .save is doing an insert into, or they'll do an update if we had an update to do. Is that right? Yeah. Birth date, whatever our birth date is. I don't know, 2022, 03. Three 14, whatever. I don't care what the actual date is. But that's what this command is doing. It's inserting a new value into our table. All right, so this is one way we could add data to our database. Let's add one more student just for good measure. Let's add another student here. Let's say this is gonna be Steve Jobs. Steve money at apple.com. Let's leave this null. So I'm not gonna specify Steve's birthday because we don't have to. So do new student save. I'm just reusing that variable I created above, right? I created a variable here, I'm gonna repurpose it here, and then actually that's not gonna work. So I need new student two. Actually, let's give this a try. I'm getting myself confused here. Well, let's see what happens. So I created a file, have some code. If I want to run this file, I'm going to do python manage.py shell, and then feed it. So angle bracket. Let me see if I can make this smaller. I'm going to feed it the file I want. So that's going to be in school app/data.py. That's where my data file is. So it's going to run this through manage.py, which is why I need this import path to be relative to manage.py, not relative to my app. So let's try running this. Hopefully I don't have any errors, but I could. Okay, got no feedback, which is a good thing for my terminal. Question is, did I actually insert data or did I actually do nothing at all? Well, let's go to our database. That's my server. Let's put a new file here. pSQL, school DB. And I want to investigate select star from school app students, semicolon. All right, so it looks like I have one record, and that's kind of what I was kind of hesitating for. It looks like we updated our existing record. And the reason that happened was because when you hit save right here, this will create a new ID. And now we're just updating that same ID. So I made a mistake here. I created a new student and then overwrote that student's records and saved over it. So I did not actually create a new student here. If I wanted to create a new student, I would need to create a new student object here. So I could do something like this. This would create a new object without that ID that existed before. So it looks like save is both going to do an insert into, and it can do an update also. So without this right here, this save was acting as an update. So we're doing updates school app set name equal to, you guys remember your querying, so I'm not going to write this out, but we're doing an update set with this save because we already have an ID on that record. If the ID does not exist, save says, all right, we need to insert this record to get an ID out of it. So if I want to do this another way, I would do this, maybe comment this out. I don't want to re-add. I do want to add Bill Gates, so we'll comment this out. All right, so if I want to run that shell script again, get out of my querying here. Trash this. All right, I'm gonna run that script again. So it's gonna rerun this file and only execute this portion. So Bill Gates should be my new student. Let's try running that by running this file. All right, so again, no errors. We could assume that got entered in. In fact, if I just want to prove it, let's try refreshing our page here, right? Previously, we had no students. If everything worked correctly, our database should have 2 records in it, and then we should be able to get that to our template file because we hooked up all the wires. What were the wires? If you remember in our views, we are querying that student model. We're calling objects.all, which is saying, get me all the student records that are in the database table for students. So assuming all this is correct, we should be able to get my data passed to my template, and my template should be able to loop over all students. Again, this name needs to match this name right here, whatever's in your dictionary. So again, a lot of pieces coming together, but if we did everything correctly, if I hit refresh here, we should see 2 students. Now, if not, I made a mistake. There we go, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. So now we're actually getting data from our database. Our view handler is taking that data, passing it to our template file, and our template file is rendering the data from our database. What questions do you guys have about method 1 of getting data into our database, which is writing kind of like a data file that's going to manually create objects here. And save is what actually pushes it to your database.
Hey, Ankur, can you show what you put in the terminal before you made your data.py file?
Before I made my data.py file. So I added nothing. All I did was create a new file. And then when I want to run that file, I run it through the shell. So I do python manage.py shell and then feed it the file I want. Those are the only 2 steps. Sorry, I know I had a few, I was kind of going through other files, but those are only 2 things you need. So again, the shell, you can write Python in there. So everything I wrote in this file right here, I can write that in the shell manually. The reason I don't like doing that is if I make a typo or whatever, like it's hard to correct in the terminal. So again, I could write from school, let's just try doing this, school app.models, import student, that work? Okay, I imported students. Now I could create another student. So new student equals student. So again, this is exactly like what I was doing in VS Code. I'm just doing that line by line here. So I create a new student. Let's create one more student through the shell alone. That name will be, who else is someone famous? Go Elon Musk. All right. We need an email that is mandatory for our model. Let's say this is Musk money at Tesla.com. Okay, and then the last thing, and don't forget, you need to actually explicitly save this to your database, else it's just, you're creating data in your application, but not storing it anywhere. So this new student that saved should push that to my database. Now, if I go back to my file here, if I refresh here, notice I got Elon Musk, another student got added. So again, option 1 is using the shell to write code to create an instance of your model and then saving it to the database by calling .save. I saw a hand raised. That was Phil. Phil, what's up?
Hey, how's it going? So is doing the .name .email, is that the only way of kind of adding all the attributes, or can you add them kind of like what we normally used to do with a normal class where you student parentheses name email birth date?
Great question. Yes, we can do it that way too. So this way is a little more formal, as in it's, if we had 20 parameters, it's probably easier to do it one by one, in my opinion. But yes, what Phil said is valid. So let's actually do that in our shell right here. So I'm going to add some new lines. Let's do new student again is going to equal student. Instead of doing it line by line, as I was doing here, as Phil was kind of hinting, yes, there's another way to do it. You do keyword arguments. I could say, let's do email first. Email is going to be, who is this person? Let's go with zuckmoney at facebook.com. And then name, as you guessed it, will be Mark Zuckerberg. And then let's say, I'm gonna leave out birthday. I don't like working with dates, but yeah, so you could do it this way, create the instance by passing in keyword arguments, so email and name in this case. Hit enter, and I'll do new student.save. All right, that should work. You could also do this in one line. I could do students. Let's do email equals, I'm running out of famous people here. Name someone famous in the tech industry. I'm blanking here.
Ariana Grande.
I don't know if she's in a tech space, but maybe she has a tech venture. So we'll go Ariana Grande. Hopefully I spelled her name correctly. Email will be arianamoney@music.com. I could do .save right here. So do it all in one line. We create an instance, and then we call save off of it. That should work. Okay, no errors. So let's check out our new students. There we go. We got Mark Zuckerberg and Ariana Grande. So we're just writing Python code. We're using Django queries. So again, .save is a query method where we're effectively doing an insert into, but we're not writing SQL. I don't want to write SQL. SQL is annoying to write. It's much easier for me to just work in Python and call save, and the magic happens behind the scenes. Any questions about option number 1? Again, using this shell, that's one way you can go about it. That's not usually my preferred way. There are better ways and maybe easier ways, I would argue, to enter data into our system. Amy, question?
Yeah, maybe you're going to go more into this, but what is the difference, or when would you want to use the shell versus the terminal?
So the shell and terminal are kind of synonymous. In this case, you get into the shell by typing in python manage.shell, or sorry, manage.py shell. This gets you into the shell, which is just writing kind of application running within your terminal, where now I could write Python here. If your question is when do you use like an external file versus internal file, that's dealer's choice. I prefer using VS Code just because it has syntax highlighting. If I make a mistake, it's easier to correct it. Like if I made a typo up here, I can't really go back and edit that because it's in the terminal. Terminal has some limitations there. So I prefer this method, create a file, and then run it through my shell by doing python manage.py shell, and then the name of the file I want to run. But effectively, it's the same thing. It's like I'm typing all these lines one by one, but instead of having to do that, it just reads my files, or reads my file and execute each line one by one instead of me typing them one by one in the shell here.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions about the shell here? Andrew?
I know it's for educational purposes, but since you're naming everything new student, makes it very difficult to go back and change any of the earlier ones doing this way, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
Almost impossible. I mean, it's possible, but it's like multiple
Yes.
lines of effort.
In that case, I would need to retrieve the student I want to update. So for example, yeah, I apologize. I'm using the same variable over and over. I could create new variables. In this case, Andrew's right. If I want to modify like Elon's email, I can't do it now because I overwrote new student. So I actually need to go back into the database, through Django, get that student back, and then update it. And let's actually take I'll do that later. I don't want to get too off the track here. So this is option 1, using a shell. I'm going to wrap this up and go to option number 2. Let's look at query set. Yeah, query set. Okay, shows us some information so we can resolve that easily. I'm going to table that also because I don't want to lose track of what I'm doing. All right, so that's option 1. So let me take notes in my models.py if you guys don't mind. Option 1, say adding new records. Option 1, as we saw, was use the Django shell. Python manage.py shell. What we did. That's not my preferred option. There's a couple other options we go with. So let's talk about fixtures. That's a Django approved way of creating seed data. So option 2 is using Django fixtures. Again, this is the more Django appropriate way. If you want to have seed data for your application, Django fixtures is the way to go about it. All right, fixtures are basically files that have data in it, and then Django is going to actually drop all the existing data and re-add the new data from the seed file. So to do that, if you go to your app folder, we're going to create a new folder and call it fixtures. This is much like, sorry, that should be in the school app level. This is much like the migrations folder, much like the templates folder. You must name this file, this folder, fixtures, for Django to identify what it's doing. All right, so I created a new folder called fixtures in my school app folder. Within this, I'm going to create a new file and call it student.json. It's going to be a JSON format of the data I want to enter into my database. So I'm not going to write SQL here. I'm going to run a JSON format. And unfortunately, I don't have this memorized, but that's what documentation is for. So I search for Django fixtures. There are different file formats. JSON is one of them. So again, I search for Django fixtures, how to provide initial data for models, exactly what I want. This is the format that JSON looks like. Again, I don't memorize JSON formatting because usually that's just annoying, but I'm going to copy this and modify it. So you need to specify all the data that you want to enter. So in this case, you need to specify what model you are targeting. So in this case, my app is named school app, and my model is students. Primary key. So you're going to tell it what ID to take on. So this is similar to like hard coding the IDs that we did last week. We're telling it specifically what primary key value it's going to take. So in this case, PK stands for primary key, item 1, and then the values for the fields. So in this case, we had name as a field, we had email as a field, and then we had birth dates. Birth dates as a field. Okay, so if you want to add Bill Gates, email. I'm going to change it to gates@microsoft.com. And then birthday, I don't know his birthday. Let's just leave that as null. Sorry. Let's leave that as one more. Hopefully that works. All right, so we have name, email. We got to repeat this for each one of our records. So let's just do 2 of them right now. We had Bill Gates and we had Steve Jobs. We'll do the short jobs at apple.com. All right, so again, kind of tedious. We gotta specify the data, but there's no other way to kind of automatically get data in here. Birth dates, leave that empty. Why is this an error? For JSON, we can't have trailing commas, so that's what the error was. All right, so we have 2 records we are specifying here. Again, we created a fixtures folder. We created a file within that to have the data we want to insert. Yulin?
Thank you. Just a quick question. So the primary key, oh, never mind. I was just about to ask that.
That was a copy and paste error. Sorry for confusion. Yeah, we want to have unique primary keys, else we'll get an error. We try to insert using the same primary key.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thanks for having me my back though. I'm not sure if this is going to work for null. I'm trying to think what the null equivalent would be, but let's give this a try and see if it works. All right, so bring up a new terminal. All right, so we created a fixtures file. In order to get this data in our database, we're going to run another Django command. So I'm going to run python manage.py, then the command of load data, one word. So manage.py, load data, one word. And then I can specify which file I want to run, or if I don't specify that, it's going to run every single file in my fixtures. In this case, I only have 1 file, so that's not much of a difference, but in this case, I'll run students. Let me change that to students. I'll make that plural, just for naming purposes. All right, so important thing here, you don't specify the extension. You just specify the name of the file. So I'm doing students without the .json. So I'm doing python manage.py, load data, students. Django is going to look at the data file here and convert that to database records. I'm not sure if this empty string is going to work for null, but we'll find out. So if I run this, run this. Okay, notice I got an error. That's fine. It looks like it didn't like my date field, so let's just add in a date field of today, 14.
Since it's nullable, can you use none?
That's what I was trying to do. So none is not a JSON format. I think I used null explicitly. Actually, you're right. So this is JSON format. So essentially JavaScript. JavaScript has null. None is for Python, but John, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah. So we can use null here. That is valid for JSON formatting. So that's what I was looking for. So we specify a birthday value or allow null. Both should be fine. Let's try to rerun this. So again, python manage.py, load data, students. Now I have appropriate data types for my birth date. So hopefully I won't get any errors. Fingers crossed. Run that. All right, there we go. Notice it says install 2 objects from 1 fixture file. Keep in mind, this is actually wiping the existing data I had in my table and reinserting only these records. So previously I had 5 records, right? It wiped that from my database, and now it's adding these 2 specific ones that I told it. So fixtures lets you kind of reset easily. If I were doing that through my data file, I would have to manually delete all the records if I wanted to kind of only add new ones. But so we've loaded these. If I refresh my page, that did not do what I wanted to do. Looks like it did not drop them. I'm stand corrected. So replace primary key 1 and 2. It looks like primary key 3, 4, and 5 remain there. That's sorry, I was not expecting that. It overwrote what I had, but did not drop the data. That's news to me. But if I had primary key 3, 4, and 5 here, it would overwrite them. So let's try that. Let's add one more primary key. And let's overwrite, I think it was Elon Musk was primary key number 3. So if I do primary key 3, let's add a new person. So in this case, we're going to add, give me a person's name. It's got to be famous people out there. Let's go with
Jack Dorsey.
Jack Dorsey, thank you. I don't know why I'm struggling with coming up with tech giants. This is Twitter guy, right?
Yeah, he ex-Twitter guy. I think he's not the Twitter guy anymore, but
Yeah, he has an interesting
Okay.
story. You guys can Google him. He's got some interesting.
yeah, that's why I chose him. He's a cool guy.
All right, so now I'm saying primary key is gonna be Jack Dorsey. So it's gonna wipe only Elon Musk and replace him with Jack Dorsey. So again, Zuckerberg and Grande should be fine. On this. All right, 3 objects. So again, it rewrote Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And now, let's see, Elon Musk. Yeah, so Elon Musk is gone, Jack Dorsey's in. So I stand corrected. Apologies for my mistake there. Your fixtures file will replace any existing items with that primary key, but will not wipe the existing data. That was my bad. I was under a different impression. All right, so that's fixtures. Still a little tedious. You gotta write all the data, have the correct formatting to specify the model, primary key, and all the fields. Not always fun to do that, but that is one way to add some data. Ivan, question?
Could you make the JSON file just delete instead of just like replace? Like, would it work to where it just like wiped it all out?
Yeah. So if I left this empty, I bet that would delete it. Well, I wouldn't know what model to delete. Let's try it. I don't think. Actually, you asked a good question because it doesn't know what model I want to delete. So, I mean, let's go to the documentation. So Django deletes all fixture data. We do it this way. We do it through a shell. So I feel like there's got to be a command to do this, like a drop data command. Let's see, drop data. So delete option, again, I'm not done this, so sorry, I'm kind of learning on the fly here. I figured there should be a command if you load data, there could be a way to like drop data, but I'll need to research that on my own. I don't want to waste your guys' time Googling. But it looks like your other options would be to delete objects. So you could write a command that says student.objects. And this goes into Django querying, which we need to cover still, but all dot delete. Yeah, so you could run a command like this in your shell. That's effectively saying for every object, delete it out of the database. So that's one option. I feel like there's got to be a way to do it with fixtures. I'm going to have to Google that because I've not done that enough. But let's go with the third option for adding data. So let's go back to our notes here. So where were they? Right here. So adding new records, we saw we could do it through the shell. We could do it through fixtures, create a file under fixtures folder and run. Maybe I should add bullet points. All right, so for this, we need to create a file under the fixtures. And then we run in our terminal, we ran Python manage manage.py load data. Optionally, we can add the file name. So file fixture file name. And this is optional. If you don't specify it, it's going to run every single fixture file for you. If you look at the documentation, which we were just on, JSON is one of many formats. So in this case, JSON is acceptable. There's also YAML, which is another just markup language or data language. I'm not sure what to call it. But YAML looks like this. Maybe a little easier to kind of write that out. So you don't need the kind of brackets and everything. So look into YAML. That's just another formatting for your file data. Yeah. So that's creating fixtures. What if I want to create fixtures for my existing data, right? So here I've got what I kind of hard coded. What if I want to convert my existing data to fixture files? That's kind of easier to do because we know how to write it out. You can go the opposite direction by doing Python manage.py dump data. This is going to go through your database tables and dump them into some file. So if I go dump data, let's say I want to do the student model, and then I run that. Oops, all right. I need to do the app name. School app is my app, and then student is my model. So Python manage.py dump data school app dot student is my model name. See what happens. All right, so notice it created a file, or it created data. I need to write that out to a file. So this is the data that got generated, but it got saved nowhere. So I need to tell it to actually write that out somewhere. So I'm going to do angle bracket. Let's just say student.json, say students dump data.json. So it's going to take the output of this command and write it out to this new file. So I hit enter. Okay, so notice a new file got created at my root level, student data, dump data.json. It looks like this, not very easy to read. JSON doesn't care about white space, so I made it nice here and pretty easy to read. The data dump is not going to care about white space. So you can still run this file. It's going to execute the same. So I can put this into my fixtures file, get rid of my students.json. Let's rename this file to be students.json. All right, cool. So now I can just run this and it'd work fine. If I do want to format that, I usually just go to the web and find a JSON formatter. This is honestly what I do. I don't know, there's probably a VS Code plugin that does this too. Let's do this here. So I'm going to copy this, drop this in here. Maybe copy it. Okay, process. There we go, much nicer. I'm going to use the nice formatted version instead of this. There we go. So we have, again, all of our records. Notice we have Mark Zuckerberg that came from our database. We have Ariana Grande. So we have a fixtures file. The reason you want to do this is because, again, if you have some test data, let's say Ivan has created a project and he has some test data. If he wants me to reuse the same data he has, he's not going to send me his database. He's just going to send me his fixtures file and I'll load that into my database. So again, we don't pass around databases because databases can get really large. So Ivan would create a fixtures file from his database records, save his project, commit to GitHub. I'd check it down. I would see that, hey, there's a fixtures file already. All I would need to do is run Python manage.py load data, and that would load it. And so that I would have the same database set up as Ivan then was working with. So load data. Again, in this case, I'm going to provide a file name. New file name. Okay, so loaded 5. Nothing should change here, except the ordering, I guess, of the records. Okay, so that was option number 2. Any questions about creating fixture files and loading them or dumping the data into them? If I'm going too fast, please ask, because we want to make sure everyone understands how to do these things.
I've got a question, Ankur.
Go for it.
Where's the dump data coming from?
The dump data is a command in Django. It's going to go through your databases. So it knows that you have created some databases for your apps. In this case, when I ran this command, I told it I want to target the students model for my school app. It knows what table corresponds to that model. So it read that table, read all the records, so select star, converted that to JSON, and then I wrote that up to my JSON file. So yeah, Django's doing all the SQL work for us. It knows which database table to look into. If you don't specify, again, the model here, this is optional. You can just do dump data. It'll go through every single one of your app tables and create the data from that. In this case, we have one model, so we can't really see that. But dump data alone, without specifying the model name, will go through every single table that you have and create all the data for you, or extract all the data for you. Wait, that was option number 2. I saved the best for last because I think it's the easiest. So let's do option number 3. Option 3, the admin panel. This is a nice UI, makes it really simple, especially when you have models that relate to each other. The admin panel is the way to go, in my opinion. If you can use it, I see no reason not to. So the admin panel is a really good built-in UI for interacting with your database. So to do this, I need to clear this console. We need to do one preliminary step. So that prelim step, I'm going to write in notes, create a super user. And how do we do that? We do $Python manage.py create super user, all one word. We're gonna run this command in our terminal. What effectively we're doing is we're creating a new actual like account that we can use with our application. Super user is basically an admin user that has rights to make, access the admin panel. So create super user, I'm gonna run that. Now your terminal is gonna ask you for some information. What do you want that admin user to be named? If you leave it blank, it's gonna use your machine name. In this case, my machine name or my machine username is Quebec Platoon. I'm gonna name my admin user admin to keep it simple. Email address, you don't need one. I'm gonna leave it blank. Password, super secret password. As you type your password, it's not gonna move the cursor, just as a heads up. I did type a password in. I'm gonna type it again. I'm gonna let you know it's not very secure. So Django is trying to protect you, but in this case, I don't care. I'm not exposing this to anyone else. So I'm gonna say yes, my crappy password's gonna be fine. Okay, so if you did everything correctly, you should see super user created successfully. My server should still be running. So I'm gonna go to my server, actually, sorry, go back to my code. Let's go back to our project folder. So we've messed with, settings, URL, sorry, app folder. Go to your app folder. There should be an admin.py file in there already. Go to admin.py and then notice the comment says register your models here. You need to tell Django which models you want access to through the admin panel. So make sure we write these in our steps, but we need to import from models, import students. All right, so get access to our student model. And then we need to run admin.sites.register, and then the model we want to show here. So we are telling the admin panel, hey, in addition to the default models, we want you to include student as another model that we can interact with. So let's add this note to our notes if we are keeping track. Data.py. So we want to register our models in app.admin.py. It might look like something like this. So admin.site.register the model name, and that should be good. Given these steps, we created a super user, we register a model, 2 steps, pretty simple. Then this gives us access to that admin panel that you guys might have known about, or maybe not. So if you go back to your project URLs, if you remember, there's this admin path that kind of has always been there. We've never really talked about it. We've always added our own paths and pointed to our app, but this is actually what the route is for our admin panel. So if I go to localhost 8000/admin, notice I have a login page. This is provided by Django. Nothing I've created. Django has an admin panel interface already. I'm going to type in my super username. In this case, my super user I named admin. You might have named him differently. And type in my super secret password. All right, log in. There we go. We have this nice panel. So there are 2 default models that Django already is going to give you access to. One is called groups, the other is users. This will be used for authentication, which is a topic we're covering next week. But notice that my own app has 1 model that I registered that I can interact with. So again, the UI makes it really simple. I go to add. Notice the fields on my model are form fields in the admin panel. So name was one of my fields, email and birth date. So I could go, who we want to go with? Jeff Bezos. I guess I left him out of the party. Bezos. His email is jeff@amazon.com. We have a nice date picker, so I don't have to worry about date formatting. Let's say Jeff's birthday was March 2nd. That gets entered in. And I can hit save. If I hit save, notice it created a 6th object here. The 6th object will be Jeff Bezos. So I've actually refreshed my page over here. I need to go to /school. So Jeff Bezos got added here. Now, one thing that you might have a question in the back of your mind, or maybe in the front of your mind, is, well, this is not very helpful. Student object 6, I know it's Jeff Bezos because I just added him, but what's student object 3? Like, I don't really know. This isn't a good experience for the user. If you remember, the reason that is not displaying anything useful is because our models, our class here, has not implemented our good old str method. So this is something we've done before. This is an instance method, so self. And then we want to return something. So f string, let's do self.name in my curly braces. There we go. So now this is what the UI will show. One thing I want to make clear here, I am not changing the structure of my model. Therefore, I do not need to run make migrations again. I've not added a new field or modified a field type or anything. I've just added a method which doesn't impact my database at all. This only impacts my use in Django. So I do not, again, do not need to run make migrations for this change that I've added right here. It's not modifying my structure of my model. But with this in place, if I refresh my admin panel, my server automatically refreshes the latest changes. There we go. We have actually something more useful. Now I know, okay, cool. Jack Dorsey is this person. If I want to edit Jack Dorsey's information, let's say it's his email is actually different, or maybe he has a birthday that we forgot to add. I can hit save, and that should update the database record. Now, obviously, I'm not showing anything here for birthday or email, but I could, right? Let's actually do that just for fun. Go back to my templates. I want to show email. So let's do students.email. And see if student.birthdate will work. All right, so I'm just changing my template, refresh here. There we go. So we got that. Notice the date is formatted nicely. We get none for nulls, but that's kind of cool. All right, I'm not going to mess with that too much, but all right, we're getting data from our database and showing it on our front end. That's the whole goal here. But admin panel is my go-to. Again, much easier in my opinion. If I want to add a new student, I just click add new student. Let's go with out of famous people. What other companies are up there? Whatever. I'll just go with John Doe. Email doe@doe.com. Birth date. So yeah, it's February birth date. Save. Yeah, really quick and simple. Keep going to the wrong tab. There we go. Took like 5 seconds to add a new person. Again, I would argue this is easier than fixtures, easier than running it through the shell because UIs are user friendly. All right, so that's option 3. Again, normally I know we want to focus on one option, but I do want to give you all the options available to you. So take your pick, whatever you think is best, kind of go with it. Try to do all 3 if you have time for them, just get experience with it. But admin panel is my vote. Go through. If I want to delete a data record, let's say Jeff Bezos is not welcome, I can click on Jeff Bezos, click delete. This will remove it from our database. Yes, I'm sure we don't want Jeff Bezos. Why do I always go to that tab? Refresh, and Jeff Bezos is no longer part of our party. So again, we are able to do our full CRUD operations just for our admin panel. So CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete, which we are doing here. So we're reading the data here. We can create a new student. We can update an existing student, right? We do Ariana songs, say whatever. Oops. Oh, this is something else I need to point out. Forget about that. So notice I got an error actually. So this is going to be a slight tangent. I apologize. I know tangents aren't what we want. I've told my database that I can enter nothing in here and it's fine. That null is a valid value. However, if I go to save Mark Zuckerberg right now, I'm going to hit save. Notice that the admin panel yells at me. This is a distinction between what the UI is expecting and what the database is expecting. So this is those added layers of security. There's security built in here. Like by default, the form expects a value. That's just the default behavior of this form. If we actually want to allow users to enter in nothing, we need to modify something so that this field doesn't expect us to enter something in. So this is a distinction between null on the database side versus entering an empty value on the UI side. So to resolve this, if you guys are curious, go to your models. In addition to null equals true, we need to enter an empty equals true. Now again, this seems like the same thing, but null, this is for the database. You're saying the field is allowed to be nothing. Empty is saying the form, any form associated with this model can allow an empty value. You might think that these should go hand in hand, but there might be reasons that you might want this to be false and this to be true. Like maybe you don't want the user to enter something in, but we want to automatically generate some value that is always going to be not null. That's why you might have a case of empty true and null false. So again, these two don't always have to match, but in this case, they're going to match. So empty equals true here. Let's save that. What did I screw up here? Let me kill my server. All right, so I think I need to make migrations, I guess. Python manage.py, make migrations. Empty is not.
Hey, Ankur, I think you meant blank instead of empty.
Thank you. It's been a while. Blank is what I want. So blank will let you allow empty values in your form. Thank you, Raphael. Yeah, blank is what I want, not empty. My bad. Okay, and then Python migrate and kick up my server again. So took it down. Python manage.py run server. All right, so this change should allow me to enter in blank values or empty values. So server is good now. If I refresh this page, let's go back to students. Go Mark Zuckerberg. All right, I'm going to save, make a modification, Zuck face at facebook.com. I'm still going to leave this blank, hit save. Notice that the UI is fine now. So again, some things to learn about, the admin panel. There are some additional layers of security there, but overall, I think the admin panel is the easiest way to add data into our system. But all options are on the table in terms of using the shell, using fixture files, or using the admin panel. There's a fourth sort of option out there, which we're not going to learn today, but we have kind of done it before, and that's the ability to dynamically add data based on the user input. So all this stuff is done during development time, where me as a developer, I'm specifying what data values I want in my database, but most applications want user input. Like if a user is signing up a new student, we need to wait and let the user enter those values in while they're using our application, and then save them as the user adds in information. So that's the idea of CRUDing based on user input. We can't do any of our options here because we're not going to give our users access to our admin panel. Admin panel is like a security or like a secure panel. Users should not have access to that because then they get too much power. So users are going to use our website, and I would have a form here that says add new user. They would enter that user information, and we would extract the information from the form, add it to our database in the backend through our views. But we're not going to do that today. For now, we're just going to focus on working with models and working with querying. So that's the last thing I need to go over before we break for lunch. Luckily, it's not too much new information. It's basically doing SQL commands, but doing it through Django querying functionality. So let's do a couple of them. I'm going to go back to my data file just to run it through my shell. So those are our notes. We'll keep those around in case we need them. But what if we want to do additional queries? Right now, we've only created data and saved data. But what if we want to extract certain records from our database? There are other commands or query commands. So don't want to delete all. So that is something I could do. Let's say we want to get, let's keep it simple for now. Let's get all students who have a non-null birth date. Right, so if we look at our users right now, we have, so Steve Jobs does not have a birth date and Zuckerberg has no birth date. So we should be able to get John Doe, Ariana Grande, Steve Jobs, and Bill Gates, or sorry, Jack Dorsey and Bill Gates. So there's other query commands we can run, and this is where, again, documentation is going to be helpful to us. In fact, I think Chris, who's a past staff member at Quebec Platoon, he actually created a cheat sheet for us. If you scroll down on today's curriculum page, there's a Django queries cheat sheet. This will be really helpful for you. You can also find Django docs on this, but cheat sheet for Django queries. Notice there's a whole bunch of them. We are not going to go over them one by one. That's up to you to read documentation, figure out which one you actually need. But notice there's a .all, which we kind of saw to get all records. What else? We did a delete. So there's a create, there's a delete. We can do delete on records. But what if we want to do filter is a good one. So filter is like doing a where clause on your select statement. So here we have an example, but let's do data equals students dot objects dot filter, and we got to tell it how to filter the data. So let's say birth date was our field. Then we got to get non-null values. So how do we do this? Not equals none. So this is the field. This is the value we don't want to match. So let's see if this, no, this is not going to work. So I need to look up documentation. So Django query not equal. So how do I do a not equal Django? Exactly what I want. Looks like I clicked on it before. So we can't do not equals. We need to use specific syntax. So here, this is called a Q object. So we're doing tilde, which is not. Again, this is from documentation, so I know this is all like, what the hell is going on here? But this is saying match something that has this ID and take the reverse of it. So that's one way we could do it. So I could say not birth date equals none. So let's try that and see if that solves it. Let's see what other suggestions they have. So exclude, that's one way to do it too. I know there's a not equals also. So, all right, we'll go with the Q operator. So here I want to do birth dates equals none. And then I'm going to take the opposite. So I want this to be not true. I need to import that Q object. What was that thing? All right, just going to copy this. I think I chose a poor example for doing not. It gets a little more complicated. Let's see what our data looks like. So if I do print data, that should show me all the student objects that do not have a birth date of none. If I've done this correctly, if not, then back to the drawing board. Let me take down my server. Control C, there we go. All right, so I'm gonna run this through the shell. So I'm gonna do Python manage.py shell, feed it school app /data.py. Hopefully I've not screwed this up. Okay, so notice our query set has 4 objects in them: Bill Gates, Jack Dorsey, John Doe, and Ariana Grande. Notice what we don't have. We do not have Steve Jobs, nor do we have Mark Zuckerberg, because we told it find all the records that have none and give us the kind of the inverse of that. So this is kind of like doing, if you guys want to go to SQL world, it's like doing a select star from students where, so this filter is doing a where birth date is not null. That's the appropriate SQL way to do it. So again, instead of writing a SQL, filter is doing the same thing as a where clause. This was not a great example, so let's do another one. And this again requires reading documentation. What if I want to get any student that has a J in their name? So Steve Jobs, Jack Dorsey, and John Doe should be returned. Ariana Grande, Mark Zuckerberg, and Bill Gates would not be part of the party. How do we do that? Well, we gotta look up documentation. So let's go to Django query set. So again, read documentation, allow battle. And these are all the methods we have available. So we saw filter, right? We use filter. What do you want to do? I know there's a contains. All right, this is not helpful. Find contains. That's what I want. So it's a contains method, which is similar to like or I like. So if you're trying to find some partial item, you can use contains. So contains in this manner would search the whole record, but there's another way to do it. So if I do, let's do data again, equals student dot objects dot get. And then I want to specify, how do I do this? It's going to be, or I want to do filter, sorry. Filter, and then I want to filter on something. So let's say name equals, I cannot do this. This is what SQL will do. You can't use wildcards in this manner, but this is where you can kind of chain on methods. This is kind of weird, but this is kind of cool also. Name is the field that I'm trying to target. Double underscore contains is a Django kind of extension, which says still use a name field, but now we're going to do it, look within that field. I see search and find a parcel match within that value. So in this case, I could do capital J, or if I want to do it insensitive like, I would do I contains. So in this case, any capital J or lowercase j. So again, this is very similar to select star from, same thing here. But now I want to do where name I like, and then single quotes, I guess. That's equivalent here. So I like is what we do in SQL. I contains, double underscore I contains is the same thing. It just, you got to figure out the Django syntax, do the same thing you want to do in SQL. So that's where documentation, reading documentation, reading documentation, that's the name of the game. All right, so if I do it this way, let's see if this works. I'm going to print the data for this new query. Let's get this out of the way. We should get only 3 objects, right? We should get Steve Jobs, Jack Dorsey, and John Doe. I guess they all have capital J's coincidentally, but that should be fine. Let's clear this. Bring our terminal up a little bit. Okay, notice we got Steve Jobs, because if they have a J, Jack Dorsey, and John Doe. All right, so underscore underscore I contains, weird syntax, but this is, lets us use a name field and kind of use a function on it. It takes a while to get used to, so I'm not going to expect you guys like say, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's just the syntax of Django allows us to kind of add additional functions to our fields that we're searching. So again, there's a lot of methods to go through. So our cheat sheet, very helpful. Figure out some ones you might want to use for your challenges tonight. We haven't gotten over all of them. There's also a range function. So if I want something that's between 2 values, hint, hint, there's a range function, which might be useful for your challenge tonight. Let's actually stop the recording here.